In 1963, the world operated under the constant, suffocating assumption that it could end at any moment. The Cold War had pushed the United States and the Soviet Union to the absolute brink, and the race to control space was widely understood as a proxy for the high ground in an imminent nuclear exchange. This diagram outlines the exact geometry of Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. When a second shot was fired at the presidential motorcade, it struck a branch of a live oak tree on the corner of Elm and Houston Streets. It shed 43 feet per second of velocity, altered its trajectory, and missed President John F. Kennedy's head by exactly 8 inches. He survived with a fractured collarbone, but doctors at Parkland Memorial Hospital noted an immediate psychological shift, a quiet, intense realization of obligation. He had grasped the fragility of his own existence and decided to apply that same scrutiny to the survival of the country. Surviving that physical anomaly forced a complete reassessment of American strategy. Kennedy stopped viewing his job as simply managing a series of escalating Cold War crises. He decided the entire architecture of global hostility had to be dismantled from the inside out. That reassessment hit the Oval Office in early 1964. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara arrived with a plan to demonstrate American commitment in Southeast Asia by doubling the 16,000 military advisors currently deployed in Vietnam. Kennedy rejected the escalation. He began asking his generals a specific question they struggled to answer. And then what? Because they could not articulate a clear terminal condition, a definitive end state for the conflict, he refused to commit American lives to an endless proxy war. This line graph maps the immediate result of that refusal. Instead of a massive troop surge, Kennedy initiated a quiet, systematic drawdown. By the spring of 1966, the total number of U.S. personnel in Vietnam dropped to 6,000, completely avoiding a full-scale ground war. Without the trauma of a massive military draft feeding hundreds of thousands of young men into a jungle conflict, the American domestic landscape stabilized. The energy of the 1960s counterculture remained intact, but it channeled into demanding economic justice and institutional reform rather than explosive, destructive anti-war protests. By avoiding the Vietnam quagmire, the administration preserved its domestic approval and its federal budget. That gave the government the political capital and the literal funding necessary to attempt something much more ambitious on the global stage. This chart highlights how those preserved resources were reallocated. During his second term, Kennedy authorized a 31% increase to NASA's budget. He argued to Congress that reaching toward the stars was the only viable alternative for a species currently pointing nuclear weapons at itself. That influx of cash purchased time and engineering confidence. With deeper resources to tackle complex physics problems, the Apollo program accelerated its timeline, successfully putting boots on the lunar surface a full month ahead of schedule in the summer of 1969. By the time Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, the political guard had shifted. Robert Kennedy won the 1968 presidential election, taking over the Oval Office and freeing his older brother to take a seat as an elder statesman on the NASA Advisory Board. From that position, John F. Kennedy made an unexpected move. In 1972, he urged the board to open formal back-channel dialogues with the Soviet Union, proposing that the two superpowers combine their resources for a joint, collaborative mission to Mars. This proposal neutralized the space race. By shifting the ultimate destination from a competition to beat the Soviets into a cooperative effort to travel together, the U.S. effectively removed one of the primary arenas for Cold War hostility. The formal realization of that proposal took place at the 1973 Vienna summit. President Robert Kennedy sat down with Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev to officially sign the Joint Lunar Mars Exploration Treaty. The public signing was just the ceremony. The actual diplomatic breakthrough occurred during a 4-hour private dinner between the two leaders, bypassing traditional State Department channels to establish a genuine, personal dialogue about the survival of their respective nations. You can see the shift in strategy here. Previous treaties focused purely on defensive limitations, agreeing on how many weapons not to build. This agreement merged opposing forces into an active partnership aimed at a shared destination. Executing this required the brightest minds to start talking. Engineers in Houston shared orbital mechanics data with Moscow, creating a permanent dependency loop. That level of shared infrastructure made armed conflict increasingly illogical. The Vienna Agreement effectively replaced the doctrine of mutually assured destruction with a practical, shared framework for extraterrestrial ambition. Venting that Cold War tension outward into space exploration organically deflated conflicts back on Earth. Without the constant, vibrating threat of immediate nuclear annihilation, local proxy disputes lost their geopolitical utility. The most visible crack in the old order happened in November 1975. Surprising almost everyone, East German border guards opened Checkpoint Charlie, and the Berlin Wall fell over a decade earlier than anticipated. This geopolitical thawing prevented the Soviet Union's sudden collapse. With the financial burden of the arms race lifted, a committee of internal reformers began addressing the country's failing economic data. These reforms were limited and painful, but they provided enough stability to ensure the continuation of the state during the transition. At the same time, the Kennedy administration pushed for stabilization closer to home. Following years of quiet negotiations, the U.S. normalized relations with Cuba, leading to active trade agreements and American companies operating in Havana by the early 1980s. By replacing existential dread with realistic, negotiated boundaries, the Soviet Union evolved. It transitioned from an apocalyptic threat that had to be destroyed into a standard global rival that could be managed. This alternate late 20th century developed a very different rhythm. The major powers spent their time and resources on domestic institution building, pursuing economic equity, and funding massive leaps in scientific achievement. Compare that to our actual timeline. The decades following 1963 cost millions of lives in grinding proxy wars and drained trillions of dollars into a sprawling, global architecture of nuclear proliferation. John F. Kennedy lived to be 107 years old. He leaves behind the proof that the survival of human civilization is a matter of attention, of directing the nation toward the things that pay attention back. The entire structure of global conflict is an ongoing human choice, and it can be dismantled, piece by piece, through pragmatic diplomacy, shared resources, and the audacity to look at the stars and decide to go together.